2 short stories by Graham Greene and read by Christopher Halton. A little place off the Edgeware Road. Craven came up past the Achilles statue in the thin summer rain. It was only just after lighting up time, but already the cars were lined up all the way to the Marble Arch, and the sharp acquisitive faces peered out ready for a good time with anything possible which came along. Craven went bitterly by with the collar of his mackintosh tight round his throat. It was one of his bad days. All the way up the park he was reminded of passion, but you needed money for love. All that a poor man could get was lust. Love needed a good suit, a car, a flat somewhere, or a good hotel. It needed to be wrapped in cellophane. He was aware all the time of the stringy tie beneath the mackintosh and the frayed sleeves. He carried his body about with him like something he hated. There were moments of happiness in the British Museum reading room, but the body called him back. He bore as his only sentiment the memory of ugly deeds committed on park chairs. People talked as if the body died too soon. That wasn't the trouble to Craven at all. The body kept alive. And through the glittering tinselly rain on his way to a rostrum, he passed a little man in a black suit carrying a banner, "The body shall rise again." He remembered a dream from which 3 times he had woken trembling. He had been alone in the huge dark cavernous burying ground of all the world. Every grave was connected to another under the ground. The globe was honeycombed for the sake of the dead, and on each occasion of dreaming he had discovered anew the horrifying fact that the body doesn't decay. There are no worms and dissolution. Under the ground the world was littered with masses of dead flesh, ready to rise again with their warts and boils and eruptions. He had lain in bed and remembered as tidings of great joy that the body after all was corrupt. He came up into the Edgeware Road walking fast. The guardsmen were out in couples, great languid elongated beasts, the bodies like worms in their tight trousers. He hated them and hated his hatred because he knew what it was: envy. He was aware that every one of them had a better body than himself. Indigestion creased his stomach. He felt sure that his breath was foul, but who could he ask? Sometimes he secretly touched himself here and there with scent. It was one of his ugliest secrets. Why should he be asked to believe in the resurrection of this body he wanted to forget? Sometimes he prayed at night. A hint of religious belief was lodged in his breast like a worm in a nut, that his body at any rate should never rise again. He knew all the side streets round the Edgeware Road only too well. When a mood was on, he simply walked until he tired, squinting at his own image in the windows of Salmon and Gluckstein and the ABCs. So he noticed at once the posters outside the disused theatre in Culper Road. They were not unusual, for sometimes Barclays Bank Dramatic Society would hire the place for an evening, or an obscure film would be trade shown there. The theatre had been built in 1920 by an optimist who thought the cheapness of the site would more than counterbalance its disadvantage of lying a mile outside the conventional theatre zone. But no play had ever succeeded, and it was soon left to gather rat holes and spider webs. The covering of the seats was never renewed, and all that ever happened to the place was the temporary false life of an amateur play or a trade show. Craven stopped and read. There were still optimists, it appeared, even in 1939, for nobody but the blindest optimist could hope to make money out of the place as the home of the silent film. The first season of Primitives was announced, a highbrow phrase. There would never be a second. Well, the seats were cheap, and it was perhaps worth a shilling to him, now that he was tired, to get in somewhere out of the rain. Craven bought a ticket and went into the darkness of the stalls. In the dead darkness, a piano tinkled something monotonous recalling Mendelssohn. He sat down in a gangway seat and could immediately feel the emptiness all around him. No, there would never be another season. On the screen, a large woman in a kind of toga wrung her hands, then wobbled with curious jerky movements towards a couch. There she sat and stared out like a sheepdog distractedly through her loose and black and stringy hair. Sometimes she seemed to dissolve altogether into dots and flashes and wiggly lines. A subtitle said, "Pompilia, betrayed by her beloved Augustus, seeks an end to her troubles." Craven began at last to see a dim waste of stalls. There were not 20 people in the place, a few couples whispering with their heads touching, and a number of lonely men like himself, wearing the same uniform of the cheap Macintosh. They lay about at intervals like corpses, and again Craven's obsession returned, the toothache of horror. He thought miserably, "I am going mad. Other people don't feel like this." Even a disused theatre reminded him of those interminable caverns where the bodies were waiting for resurrection. A slave to his passion, Augustus calls for yet more wine. A gross middle-aged Teutonic actor lay on an elbow with his arm round a large woman in a shift. The spring song tinkled ineptly on, and the screen flickered like indigestion. Somebody felt his way through the darkness, scrabbling past Craven's knees. A small man. Craven experienced the unpleasant feeling of a large beard brushing his mouth. Then there was a long sigh as the newcomer found the next chair, and on the screen events had moved with such rapidity that Pompilia had already stabbed herself, or so Craven supposed, and lay still and buxom among her weeping slaves. A low, breathless voice sighed out close to Craven's ear. "What's happened? Is she asleep?" "No, dead." "Murdered?" the voice asked with a keen interest. "I don't think so. Stabbed herself." Nobody said hush. Nobody was enough interested to object to a voice. They drooped among the empty chairs in attitudes of weary inattention. The film wasn't nearly over yet. There were children somehow to be considered. Was it all going on to a second generation? But the small bearded man in the next seat seemed to be interested only in Pompilia's death. The fact that he had come in at that moment apparently fascinated him. Craven heard the word coincidence twice, and he went on talking to himself about it in low, out-of-breath tones. Absurd when you come to think of it. And then, no blood at all. Craven didn't listen. He sat with his hands clasped between his knees, facing the fact, as he had faced it so often before, that he was in danger of going mad. He had to pull himself up, take a holiday, see a doctor. God knew what infection moved in his veins. He became aware that his bearded neighbour had addressed him directly. "What?" he asked impatiently. "What did you say?" "There would be more blood than you can imagine." "What are you talking about?" When the man spoke to him, he sprayed him with damp breath. There was a little bubble in his speech like an impediment. He said, "When you murder a man—" "This was a woman," Craven said impatiently. "That wouldn't make any difference. And it's got nothing to do with murder anyway." "That doesn't signify." They seemed to have got into an absurd and meaningless wrangle in the dark. "I know, you see," the little bearded man said in a tone of enormous conceit. "Know what?" "About such things," he said with guarded ambiguity. Craven turned and tried to see him clearly. Was he mad? Was this a warning of what he might become, babbling incomprehensibly to strangers in cinemas? He thought, by God, no, trying to see, "I'll be sane yet, I will be sane." He could make out nothing but a small black hump of body. The man was talking to himself again. He said, "Talk, such talk. They'll say it was all for £50. But that's a lie. Reasons and reasons. They always take the first reason. Never look behind. 30 years of reasons. Such simpletons," he added again, in that tone of breathlessness and unbounded conceit. So this was madness. So long as he could realize that, he must be sane himself. Relatively speaking, not so sane perhaps as the seekers in the park or the guardsmen in the Edgeware Road, but saner than this. It was like a message of encouragement as the piano tinkled on. Then again the little man turned and sprayed him. "Killed herself, you say? But who's to know that? It's not a mere question of what hand holds the knife." He laid a hand suddenly and confidingly on Craven's. It was damp and sticky. Craven said with horror, as a possible meaning came to him, "What are you talking about?" "I know," the little man said. "A man in my position gets to know almost everything." "What is your position?" Craven asked. feeling the sticky hand on his, trying to make up his mind whether he was being hysterical or not. After all, there were a dozen explanations. It might be treacle. A pretty desperate one, you'd say. Sometimes the voice almost died in the throat altogether. Something incomprehensible had happened on the screen. Take your eyes from these early pictures for a moment, and the plot had proceeded on at such a pace. Only the actors moved slowly and jerkily. A young woman in a nightdress seemed to be weeping in the arms of a Roman centurion. Craven hadn't seen either of them before. "I am not afraid of death, Lucius. In your arms." The little man began to titter knowingly. He was talking to himself again. It would have been easy to ignore him altogether if it had not been for those sticky hands which he now removed. He seemed to be fumbling at the seat in front of him. His head had a habit of lolling sideways like an idiot child's. He said distinctly and irrelevantly, "Bayswater tragedy." "What was that?" Craven said. He had seen those words on a poster before he entered the park. "What?" "About the tragedy. To think they called Cullen Mews Bayswater." Suddenly the little man began to cough, turning his face towards Craven and coughing right at him. It was like vindictiveness. The voice said, "Let me see my umbrella." He was getting up. "You didn't have an umbrella." "My umbrella," he repeated. "My," and seemed to lose the word altogether. He went scrabbling out past Craven's knees. Craven let him go, but before he had reached the billowy dusty curtains of the exit, the screen went blank and bright. The film had broken, and somebody immediately turned up one dirt-choked chandelier above the circle. It shone down just enough for Craven to see the smear on his hands. This wasn't hysteria, this was a fact. He wasn't mad, he had sat next to a madman who in some muse— what was the name? Colin? Craven jumped up and made his own way out. The black curtain flapped in his mouth, but he was too late. The man had gone and there were 3 turnings to choose from. He chose instead a telephone box and dialed with a sense of odd for him of sanity and decision. 999. It didn't take 2 minutes to get the right department. They were interested and very kind. Yes, there had been a murder in a mews, Cullen Mews. A man's neck had been cut from ear to ear with a bread knife. A horrid crime. He began to tell them how he had sat next the murderer in a cinema. It couldn't be anyone else. There was blood on his hands, and he remembered with repulsion as he spoke the damp beard. There must have been a terrible lot of blood. But the voice from the yard interrupted him. "Oh no," it was saying. "We have the murderer, no doubt of it at all. It's the body that's disappeared." Craven put down the receiver. He said to himself aloud, "Why should this happen to me? Why to me?" He was back in the horror of his dream. The squalid, darkening street outside was only one of the innumerable tunnels connecting grave to grave where the imperishable bodies lay. He said, "It was a dream," and leaning forward he saw in the mirror above the telephone his own face sprinkled by tiny drops of blood like dew from a scent spray. He began to scream, "I won't go mad, I won't go mad, I'm sane, I won't go mad." Presently a little crowd began to collect, and soon a policeman came. The end. "Proof positive." The tired voice went on. It seemed to surmount enormous obstacles to speech. The man's sick, Colonel Crashaw thought with pity and irritation. When a young man he had climbed in the Himalayas, and he remembered how at great heights several breaths had to be taken for every step advanced. The 5-foot-high platform in the music rooms of the spa seemed to entail for the speaker some of the same effort. He should never have come out on such a raw afternoon, thought Colonel Crashaw, pouring out a glass of water and pushing it across the lecturer's table. The rooms were badly heated, and yellow fingers of winter fog fell for cracks in the many windows. There was little doubt that the speaker had lost all touch with his audience. It was scattered in patches about the hall, elderly ladies who made no attempt to hide their cruel boredom, and a few men with the appearance of retired officers who put a show of attention. Colonel Crashaw, as president of the local psychical society, had received a note from the speaker a little more than a week before. Written by a hand which trembled with sickness, age or drunkenness, it asked urgently for a special meeting of the society. An extraordinary, really impressive experience was to be described while still fresh in the mind, though what the experience had been was left vague. Colonel Crashaw would have hesitated to comply if the note had not been signed by a Major Philip Weaver, Indian Army, retired. One had to do what one could for a brother officer. The trembling of the hand must be either age or sickness. It proved principally to be the latter when the two men met for the first time on the platform. Major Weaver was not more than 60, tall, thin and dark, with an ugly, obstinate nose, and satire in his eye, the most unlikely person to experience anything unexplainable. What antagonized Crashaw most was that Weaver used scent. A white handkerchief which drooped from his breast pocket exhaled as rich and sweet an odour as a whole altar of lilies. Several ladies prinked their noses, and General Leadbitter asked loudly whether he might smoke. It was quite obvious that Weaver understood. He smiled provocatively and asked very slowly, "Would you mind not smoking? My throat has been bad for some time." Crashaw murmured that it was terrible weather. Influenza throats were common. The satirical eye came round to him and considered him thoughtfully, while Weaver said in a voice which carried halfway across the hall, "It's cancer in my case." In the shocked, vexed silence that followed the unnecessary intimacy, he began to speak without waiting for any introduction from Crashaw. He seemed at first to be in a hurry. It was only later that the terrible impediments were placed in the way of his speech. He had a high voice which sometimes broke into a squeal, and must have been peculiarly disagreeable on the parade ground. He paid a few compliments to the local society. His remarks were just sufficiently exaggerated to be irritating. He was glad, he said, to give them the chance of hearing him. What he had to say might alter their whole view of the relative values of matter and spirit. Mystic stuff, thought Crashaw. Weaver's high voice began to shoot out hurried platitudes. The spirit, he said, was stronger than anyone realized. The physiological action of heart and brain and nerves were subordinate to the spirit. The spirit was everything. He said again, his voice squeaking up like bats into the ceiling, "The spirit is so much stronger than you think." He put his hand across his throat and squinted sideways at the window panes and the nuzzling fog, and upwards at the bare electric globe sizzling with heat and poor light in the dim afternoon. "It's immortal," he told them very seriously, and they shifted, restless, uncomfortable and weary in their chairs. It was then that his voice grew tired and his speech impeded. The knowledge that he had entirely lost touch with his audience may have been the cause. An elderly lady at the back had taken her knitting from a bag, and her needles flashed along the walls when the light caught them, like a bright, ironic spirit. Satire for a moment deserted Weaver's eyes, and Crashaw saw the vacancy it left, as though the ball had turned to glass. "This is important," the lecturer cried to them. "I can tell you a story." His audience's attention was momentarily caught by this promise of something definite, but the stillness of the lady's needles did not soothe him. He sneered at them all. "Signs and wonders," he said. Then he lost the thread of his speech altogether. His hand passed to and fro across his throat, and he quoted Shakespeare, and then St. Paul's epistle to the Galatians. His speech, as it grew slower, seemed to lose all logical order, though now and then Crashaw was surprised by the shrewdness in the juxtaposition of two irrelevant ideas. It was like the conversation of an old man which flits from subject to subject, the thread a subconscious one. "When I was at Simla," he said, bending his brows as though to avoid the sunflash on the barrack square, but perhaps the frost, the fog, the tarnished room broke his memories. He began to assure the wearied faces all over again that the spirit did not die when the body died, but that the body only moved at the spirit's will. One had to be obstinate to grapple. Pathetic, Crashaw thought, the sick man's clinging to his belief. It was as if life were an only son who was dying, and with whom he wished to preserve some form of communication. A note was passed to Crashaw from the audience. It came from a Dr. Brown, a small alert man in the third row. The society cherished him as a kind of pet skeptic. The note read, "Can't you make him stop? The man's obviously very ill, and what good is his talk anyway?" Crashaw turned his eyes sideways and upwards and felt his pity vanish at the sight of the roving satirical eyes that gave the lie to the tongue and all the smell, overpoweringly sweet, of the scent in which Weaver had steeped his handkerchief. The man was an outsider. He would look up his record in the old army lists when he got home. "Proof positive," Weaver was saying, sighing a shrill breath of exhaustion between the words. Crashaw laid his watch upon the table, but Weaver paid him no attention. He was supporting himself on the rim of the table with one hand. "I'll give you," he said, speaking with increasing difficulty, "proof, Paul." His voice scraped into stillness, like a needle at a record's end, but the quiet did not last. From an expressionless face, a sound which was more like a high mew than anything else jerked the audience into attention. He followed it up, still without a trace of any emotional understanding, with a succession of incomprehensible sounds, a low labial whispering, an odd jangling note while his fingers tapped on the table. The sounds brought to mind innumerable seances, the bound medium, the tambourine shaken in mid-air, the whispered trivialities of love ghosts in the darkness, the dinginess, the airless rooms. Weaver sat down slowly in his chair and let his head fall backwards. An old lady began to cry nervously, and Dr. Brown scrambled onto the platform and bent over him. Colonel Crashaw saw the doctor's hand tremble as he picked the handkerchief from the pocket and flung it away from him. Crashaw, aware of another and more unpleasant smell, heard Dr. Brown whisper, "Send them all away! He's dead!" He spoke with a distress unusual in a doctor accustomed to every kind of death. Crashaw, before he complied, glanced over Dr. Brown's shoulder at the dead man. Major Weaver's appearance disquieted him. In a long life he had seen many forms of death, men shot by their own hand and men killed in the field, but never such a suggestion of mortality. The body might have been one fish from the sea a long while after death. The flesh of the face seemed as ready to fall as an overripe fruit. So it was with no great shock of surprise that he heard Dr. Brown's whispered statement. The man must have been dead a week. What the Colonel thought of most was Weaver's claim, proof positive. Proof, he had probably meant that the spirit outlived the body, that it lasted eternity. But all he had certainly revealed was how, without the body's aid, the spirit in 7 days decayed into whispered nonsense. The end.